Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be back this year. Most of the time they don't invite us for repeat speeches. Okay, a little bit taller. Okay, so it's a pleasure to be back here today. So what I want to do today, and if we bring up the slides, I'm going to do this. I'm going to talk about demand from the consumer side and the political strength or economic strength that we're seeing. You know, I do get a chance as Wells Fargo ag economist to talk to a lot of people. I've been in this position for 24 years now. 24 years is a long time, right? And I've never been promoted, right? But I've never been demoted either, so evidently it was the right spot to start with. So, you know, I really have a great opportunity to talk to people. Okay, let's see how this is working. There we go. And talk to a lot of people across the spectrum. You know, and what I find is people are really expert in what they do, but they sometimes don't understand the downstream demand or the upstream supply in their world. And so what we're going to talk about is what I want to make this point is that, okay, that don't fear recessions in agriculture. Now, if you don't remember anything else other than this, is that we've only had 3 recessions since 1998. Think about that. You know how many recessions have been predicted by economists? 37, okay? We've had 3. So, and remember this from last year, the leaf blowers. It's kind of an interesting thing. It's a California theme song, right? But it's interesting that people worry about recessions. Now, recessions do matter, but they don't happen very often. Think about that. We name recessions just like we name hurricanes. 3 recessions since 1998. We've had the tech stock recession. Who in this room is old enough to remember the tech stock recession? Okay, good. Now we know who the oldies are, right? How about the great banking housing recession of 2008, 2009? Anybody remember that one? Yeah, okay. How about the COVID recession? Everybody can raise their hand in that one. There's nobody young enough in this room not to remember the COVID recession. Okay, but it's 3 recessions. And in none of the 3 recessions did the U.S. consumer abandon food spending. In fact, even in the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, we saw a 5.5% collapse in employment. That's big. 5.5% contraction from peak to trough in employment. Food spending never went down. So if you're in this room today as part of the agricultural system, you should not be worrying about recessions because they're not going to slow down food demand. Now, what I hear a lot, and I travel across the country, talk to people in all sorts of unique spots of the world, whether it's kosher wine like last week or Mexican retailing in Southern California a couple weeks ago. People are worried about demand, and they look at their demand. But here's something I want you to remember. We have more people living in the United States today than ever before. We're not exactly how many, so that's one of the things we're dealing with. But we know it's the largest population ever, and food demand starts with people. Second, we have the largest economy we've ever had, both in nominal terms, that means not adjusted for inflation, and in inflation-adjusted terms. So more money than ever before, and more jobs. When we look at payroll numbers, we have more people working in payroll today than we've ever had before. So you can't tell me that you think there's going to be weak food demand in the market. The demand is going to be there. Now, the question that you have as business operators is, well, what's the price and can I make profits at that price? That's a fair question, right? Anybody have a concern about that this year? It's a good question to have, right? But let's think about that. Demand's going to be there. So if you're good at what you do, you will have sales. The question is whether the prices will be strong enough if you don't want to make those sales. So let's kind of go through this. Let's talk about that. Let's look at the economy. So what we have here is 2 things. We have that top line, which is called nominal GDP. Nominal GDP is not adjusted for inflation, but it's what I call checkbook inflation or checkbook economy. It's what's in your checkbook and my checkbook. So this is how the world is. We're approaching a $30 trillion economy. So when you hear numbers, big numbers like national debt, credit card debt, and other things, you want to compare it to this number because we don't take inflation out of those numbers either. The line underneath it is adjusted for inflation. This is what we call inflation-adjusted, a real GDP. It's also the highest we've ever had. So why does the economy keep growing? People get pessimistic. They say, they give you a list of things that are not good. And you know what? They're right. But why does the economy keep growing? For the same reason that California agriculture keeps growing. More people, more capital, and better technology. Do you really think anything's going to change that in the United States in the next, I don't know how many years? More people, more capital, and more technology. Of course, the economy is going to grow. Your business model, in whatever part of the world you're in, should be based on the fact that it's going to keep growing. That it occasionally has a contraction and then goes back to growth, that's not a thing to argue about. But it's the trend that's really important to us. So more money, more people, more jobs. So more money, more income. So here we'll look at this. This is inflation-adjusted personal income and inflation-adjusted spending. Okay. You can look at the contraction around COVID and then look at the recovery following it. You can argue about certain growth rates. You can say, I wish I saw more of this and less of that, depending on your preference. But you can't look at this chart and not say the money's there. Now, this is inflation-adjusted. People have the money. The question is, where do they want to spend it? They want to spend it where they think they get the best value, right? Who goes to the supermarket and buys the thing they like least for the highest price? Anybody do that? Oh, you're not economists. Okay, you're smarter than economists. That's what economists do. Buy the thing they like the least for the highest price. Nobody does that, right? So people have the money. The question is, do they want to buy something? We were talking about almonds earlier. Are we going to see 3-pound almonds? Well, no, not very quickly. Why? Because that's an awful lot of almonds to sell at $3. It just depends on what you want to sell and how. What else? I said before, I'm going to show you here, jobs. Now, we measure jobs in two ways. One is payroll. We ask companies, how many people do you have working for you? And here's an interesting thing. I've been asking that question for 24 years. And the bigger the company, the bigger a wiggle room they need to give you. Why? Because people start, people quit, and you don't know at any given day how many people are working for you. It's really easy when it's a small company, 5 or 6 people, to know how many people are working for you. You start asking people of thousands and thousands of people working for you, they're like, yeah, I think I have about this many people working for me, but I better check with HR. So payroll is a pretty good number, but it's not perfect. The number above that is what we call household employment. We survey people and say, are you working? Are you looking for work? Are you working part-time? We try to understand the job market. But think about that. Who answers their phone today? When you get a call from somebody you don't know, do you answer your phone? If you're under 25, you don't even look at it, right? I know you. I got 3 kids, 29, 28, and 27. They don't go to voicemail, and they might read the voicemail and they might not, right? So who in the world's talking to the surveyors? Elderly people. That's not a good indicator. So they're the only people polite enough to pick up their phone. So we're having a hard time figuring out how much household employment we have. And they've admitted it. It's a tough survey because people won't respond to it. But more jobs, more people, higher GDP. We're going to sell a lot of food. Now, is the job market strong or weak? It's hard to say. Why? Because it's been so crazy. Look at what happened through this whole COVID period. We went into COVID, we had more jobs than we had unemployed people. It was a tight market. It was raising wage rates faster than we anticipated. That's why the Federal Reserve had interest rates higher just before COVID. Then we hit COVID, we see this incredible spike in unemployment, the drop in job openings, and then look what happens. In the middle of 2022, there was like a 6 million person gap. We had more jobs than we had people unemployed. We've started to see this come back closer and closer to kind of equilibrium. But what is normal? I don't know. Is there a new normal? I don't know. My favorite answer is I don't know and I was wrong. And those are acceptable for economists, right? So when you think about this, but this is still a tight job market. So when we think about what the Federal Reserve is going to do about interest rates, what are they going to do about fiscal policy, monetary policy, all these things do matter to us. Now, we just got another rate cut. They just took out 25 basis points. But let's think about interest rates. Interest rates are important to agriculture, right? When we had low interest rates, because the Federal Reserve was keeping things down, trying to get the economy stimulated, what did that do to land values? Anybody remember that? When you can borrow money cheap, what do you do when you go out to buy an asset? You bid it up, right? When interest rates go up, you have to change what you bid for assets. So we've heard a lot, everybody in this room is intensely aware that there's been some major issues around what is California agricultural land worth? Well, it's a good question. And here's the thing you got to ask. At what interest rate, right? How much water? Those are the things that matter to people. You can't say, well, this is the right price for farm ground. Well, it depends on a lot of other things that are going to happen in the near future. So we're just starting to see short-term interest rates come down. Let's talk about that for a second. What does the Federal Reserve actually control? They control the short end of the curve. Federal Open Market Committee sets the Fed funds rate. That's the overnight interbank lending rate, okay? That's what they control. The short-term market, which you guys borrow at today, is no longer LIBOR, typically not prime, but it's called SOFR, Secured Overnight Financing Rate. So that market floats together. What the Fed doesn't really control but can influence is the longer end of the curve through quantitative tightening and quantitative easing. So there's a lot of things going on. So how far down are the interest rates going to go? What do you think my answer is? I don't know, right? How could I know, right? Because it depends on what's going to happen here over the next number of months. If the job market stays pretty robust and wage rates are higher than expected, the Fed's not going to cut interest rates as much as some people anticipated. Now, the market's always making a new guess on a daily basis. But let's talk a little bit about the longer end of the market. And this is where I want to point out that it wasn't about California agriculture, but it had a huge impact. Look what happened right after COVID there. The Federal Reserve went out and purchased enormous amounts of securities. That put a lot of money into the economy, and it also depressed the yield on treasuries. Look at the 10-year treasury right in that post-COVID moment. It was down around 0.5%. 10-year treasuries, which are the benchmark for long-term lending, was at 0.5%. You could go out and borrow money really, really cheaply for houses and for farm ground. And so what did people do with that cheap money? They looked at the same piece of farm ground they had looked at 2 years ago, and they bid up higher. Well, guess what? That's past us. Now we're back at 4.4. I checked the market this morning. 10-year treasury at the market trade at 8:15 a.m. Eastern time was 4.4, okay? Well, what does that mean to people in this room? Well, if you want to go out and get a mortgage for 20-year money to buy a piece of farm ground, it's going to be a lot more expensive than it was 3 years ago, right? So what are you going to do about it? You're not going to bid as much for that farm ground, right? Because you need a cash flow. So we look at this and we say to ourselves, what do we know about the future? It's certainly going to be higher than it was post-COVID. So farm ground in the state of California, in the state of North Carolina, Florida, everywhere is adjusting to the new reality that it's more expensive to borrow money. Is that about agriculture? No. None of this is about agriculture, but agriculture has to make that adjustment to it. So, we look at these things, we say, well, where's the inflation rate going? We just got out CPI numbers today. I love CPI numbers because they're like a Rorschach test, right? Remember those Rorschach tests where you look at this big ink blot and you're supposed to see something in there, right? The analysts are like that every single day. Oh, look at that CPI number. It's perfect. And somebody says, no, it's horrible. You're like, well, which is it? Good or perfect? Horrible or terrible? I don't know. But we can look at something called PCE deflator. This is what the Federal Reserve tells us they're looking at when they set interest rates. So they said personal consumption deflator. It's coming down. But is it low yet? No. What's the official target? They really don't have one, but what's their whisper number? What do they talk about? 2%. So as this PCE deflator number comes down and settles closer to 2%, they will lower interest rates. They will both lower the short end of the curve through the Federal Open Market Committee we talked about before, and they will work on quantitative easing to kind of bring down the 10-year end of the curve on the Fed funds, on the treasuries, excuse me. This is what they're looking at. If this is what they're looking at, this is what you should be looking at, right? You're not going to change the Federal Reserve's mind, but you should listen to them and look at what they look at so you can anticipate. Now let's talk about that. Anticipation versus forecasting. How do you know economists have a sense of humor? We use decimal points when we forecast. There's a real wink and a nod at you that we're having a little fun at your expense, right? So forecasting is going to be wrong. Anticipation is a different thing. Anybody love a good quarterback? Minnesota doesn't have any, but anybody love a good quarterback? Good quarterbacks just anticipate things. They're not forecasting, but they get that sixth sense that something's going to happen and they act on it. You should have that as well. You should be the quarterback of your business and know when you're going to get blitzed by higher interest rates or get an opportunity to throw a long pass because you have lower interest rates. This is the stuff that you look at when you're thinking about that. So let's move a little closer. That's kind of the general ag, environment that we're facing as an economy. But I want to talk about how weird it was and why we need to go back to thinking about some of the fundamentals. What are we looking at here? We're looking at retail sales for grocery stores, supermarkets, and we're looking at wholesale inventories for food. So the top line there is sales, the bottom line there is wholesale, as the inventories. Now, when you look at this chart, if you think about it, the story becomes pretty clear. We see this incredible spike up around COVID, and then we just see that continuous rise. Most of that is price inflation. Most of that is not people eating more, but there's some of that going on, but it's higher prices. So we see those sales just keep rising, and then they kind of plateau because we see inflation slowing down. Now look at the wholesale inventory. For the first part of that jump up, it didn't grow. Supply chain was disrupted. You couldn't get trucks. Remember what you guys were paying to move product, refrigerated product from the West Coast to the East Coast? It was phenomenally expensive. You couldn't get packages. You couldn't get pallets. So inventory couldn't grow because manufacturers were stuck in a bad spot. But then look what happens in 2022. We start to see that wholesale inventory number really jump up in a big way. Why? Because people wanted to put a lot of things into the supermarket. They're making good money. Interest rates are low. They're like, I don't care about inventory. So they built up a lot of inventory in the supermarket chain. What do you think that is? Let me point this out very clearly. You don't see final sales. As a supplier, you don't. Neither, they see it, but what you're seeing is your sales to the retail or the food service market. And people thought sales were great. You could be really tough on pricing. But then there's a peak. We see that wholesale number peaks and starts to come back down. Why? I can tell you why, because I've talked to the CFOs and the controllers at supermarket companies. They had too much inventory. It was really hurting them, and interest rates started to rise. So suddenly you have too much inventory and interest rates are going up. What do you think they're going to do? Cut back on orders, try to get their supply chain more evened out. So suddenly we're seeing weak orders, and what do people start saying? Oh, the consumer's really hurting. Consumers not buying what they bought before. The answer is, well, how would you know? No one has access to enough data to give you that answer. How about Nielsen data? We're big users of Nielsen data. Let me share something with you. Who's not in Nielsen? Walmart's not in Nielsen. Costco's not in Nielsen. All these are not in Nielsen. A lot of the major retailers are not in Nielsen. So when you look at Nielsen retail data, it's a great indicator. They're wonderful people, smart people. But is it universal? No. So we went through this destocking process. And let's look at this kind of as a thermostat. Let's look at that inventory turns ratio. We saw it right around 1.62 at the start there, and then it jumped up to 2 on that huge spike. And then it went all the way down to 1.4. That was great because you were selling them more stuff, but they weren't selling it to the final consumer. So then they started to say, we need to get our inventory numbers back into balance. And that's what they've been working on. What's the good news in this chart? The thermostat is back to where it was before. So we're neither fighting destocking or are they restocking or overstocking. So we're back to a pretty normal environment. That's good news. We're not having to deal with one of those big adjustments going on right now. Another thing I want to point out is capacity utilization. It's a big deal. Let's look at the food manufacturing data. So go back and look at how much of their capacity are they using. Think about this as a competitive issue. When you have very low utilization of your capacity, what do you want to do? You want to go out and get more customers. You want to sell more things because you're saying, I'm running my factory at the bottom there, 79% utilization. I would love to get that up into the 90s. If I get it up in the 90s, I have a lot of fixed costs. More utilization means more profit. What's the problem for the industry as a whole? If you want to do that, so do your competitors. They want to get more market share. They want to get more sales. So you're beating each other up to get more sales. And how do you do that? Negotiating on price, right? Now let's look at what happened during COVID. We ran that number all the way up to 87.1. That's a big change. So the industry, the food manufacturing industry, packaging, wholesaling, all that stuff, they felt pretty cocky. They're like, hey, we can finally call the shots. We can tell the retailer they got to take this price increase or we'll go down the street and sell to somebody else. It was a good time. We're going to see the numbers a little bit later. Food manufacturing really benefited from high capacity utilization. What's happened since then? We're going back to normal. Let's look at the last number of years. We're going all the way up to 2014 there. It's usually between 80 and 82%. That's what normal is. That's where this industry kind of shakes out at not putting in more capacity or not shaking out capacity. So as we go back to that, what do you think the industry is going to have to fight about? Market share. So even though the consumer's there, the retailers square it up, what's the fly in the ointment, as they say? it's going to be your competitors. Anybody have any silly competitors? I'll use that word. Nobody has any silly competitors? Oh, I'm looking at you, Wells Fargo bankers. Anybody have any silly competitors? I know you could raise your hand, but you're too polite to do so, right? Everybody has silly competitors, people that are willing to go out and do one dumb deal more, right? It's just the way it works out there. And when do they do their dumbest deals? Is when they're the most desperate, when they have low capacity utilization, when they're going out of business. That's when they're really going to make your world miserable. And that's just the way the thermostat works. Right now, the thermostat's set too high. It's going to come down. So it might go underneath where it normally is. We see these long-term cycles over time. I'm going to make this point again. Just want to say, the consumer doesn't abandon you. 3 recessions since 1998. 3. They don't happen very often. Do not run your business based on a recession forecasting. But food spending, here on this chart, you can see that dark line is the PCE, personal consumption expenditure on food, as measured by the government. I always love to say that as measured by the government, because that takes all my guilt away from saying the number. But here we have the 3 recessions that you can see. If you look at that line, in none of the 3 recessions, even the Great Recession, 5.5% contraction in employment, did food spending go down. Why? Because nobody goes there to save money. You know what you will hear is stories. If we had a recession in 2025, you'll hear lots of stories about how people have changed how they spend their money on food. Yeah, we've never seen that before. I don't expect to see it. Why? Let's look at what we know about food spending. Food consumption expenditure as a percent of total spending. Look at this. Go all the way back to 1959. In 1959, basically 1 out of $5 was spent on food. Was it the same food that we eat today? It was not nearly as convenient. It was not nearly as fresh and healthy as it was. What was 1959 food like? Who in the room is old enough to remember 1959 food? I'm close enough, right? It was pot roast. It was potatoes. It was carrots. It was not packaged food. It was not eating away from home. Today, Uber Eats, and we're still at 7.8% of personal consumption expenditure. Americans are spoiled. Anybody agree with that? Americans are spoiled about good food. They just don't know how good they have it, right? But they're not going to go here to save money in a recession. This is this is a set baseline. It's so small. It would be trips to Disneyland. It would be big screen TVs. That's how you save money in a recession. Okay, this I shared with a retailer here in California a little while ago, and I just want to make this point. You're here talking about California. It would be nice if California did something different to get their game back on. Any agreement on that? Because let's look at this. This is population growth or not growth compared to the U.S. average. So I just want to point out, California has really started to lose population. What's the average population growth right now in the United States? About 0.5%, right? So if you have 0.5%, you'd be at 0 on this chart. California is actually negative. And so we're seeing depopulation going on in California. That's a big issue. And that's beyond my pay grade. If I could solve that problem, I think I'd ask Wells Fargo for a bigger paycheck. They wouldn't give it to me anyways. But you can see the food's going to flow to where people are. And so are the retailers, and so are the other things. So the question is, what's going to drive this long term? And there's a lot of things. So let's talk food inflation. What's the bad news for people in this room? I don't have today's numbers in here. I didn't update them. But food inflation is going back to 1%. Now, that's a lot of things in there. But 1% is good for the consumer. It's tough on the producer, right? Because 1% food inflation kind of caps the total revenue that we have in the food sector, which you guys are participating in. So what does that mean? If you guys have costs that are rising faster than 1% or faster than your revenue, what do you have to do? You said it well. Change. You're going to have to make adjustments. You're going to have to do things differently. There's going to be consolidation. There's going to be more technology. So food inflation has definitely come back down in a big way. And it's going to stay down because that's typical of the United States. Now, underneath the surface, I picked out 3 sectors that are very important to California: meat, poultry, eggs, and then the dairy sector, and then fruits and vegetables. And you can see they don't all operate at the same time in the same way. But fruits and vegetables in particular is a category that's very constrained for top line growth. Why? Because you can grow fruits and vegetables in a lot of places in the world. Mexico, Peru, Chile, you name it, they can grow something there. And with today's cold store chain, you can move it a long ways and still be good. So, but I want to make this point. The consumer doesn't know how good they have it. They don't know. But the good news is you make it so appealing and so cheap, they're going to eat more of it. I'm going to use one example here. I want to talk about how things aren't the way we hear. How much food are people eating? We've heard a lot of stories about how the recession hurt people. They didn't eat as much. They changed how they ate. Things like GLP-1s, Ozempic type drugs coming along, changing how people eat. Well, I'll believe it when we see it. So this is what we call food disappearance. This is calories per day per person. Where do I get this number? I'm going to go to the Food Agricultural Organization in the UN and say, what are you telling people? And this is what they're telling people through 2022. You can see that during COVID, we actually saw more food disappearance per person per day than we did pre-COVID. Wow. And that's through high food inflation. 2022 was the peak of food inflation. We had food inflation in July of 2022 running at almost 14% year over year. But yet, at the end of the year, did people eat less food? No. Now, let's be very clear. This is food disappearance, okay? We don't know whether they actually ate it or threw it away, right? We know they do both of those things. And what's the other magic number in here that we don't know? Population, right? What if we had more population in the United States than we thought we did, and we're dividing by a smaller number than we should? Well, then this number would be lower, because we're going to have more people, and the per capita number would be lower, okay? So you take all numbers with a grain of salt, but you can't tell me that we had poor sales even when we had record food inflation. We actually saw more food disappearance per capita than before. The numbers matter. Most of the people in this room are at the university, right? And they are scientists, and they're economists, and they're business people. You got to look at the data. You can't just listen to the story. You got to go look at the data. And here's a great point. We have strawberry prices going back a long, long time. In fact, these go all the way back to 1981. That's a long time. And if you look at this, you'd say, wow, strawberry prices are towards record high strawberry prices at retail. Well, they are on a nominal basis. But the price of anything is what you give up to get it. So what do you think this number will look like if we compare it to what people are earning? Now, there's a big question mark. What are they earning? But this is the number that I found. Today, in 2024, year to date, they can buy the most strawberries per hour of work that they could ever buy in this data set. Why do you think they would eat less strawberries? There's absolutely no reason to eat less strawberries. And the strawberries today that you guys are giving them are better strawberries than they were before. You worked very hard to give them better varieties, better bricks, better handling, all that stuff. You look at this number, they can buy 11.5 pints of strawberries per hour of work. In 2004, that was 7. You go all the way back to the early 80s, it was 10.8. So we've gone past that peak. There's no reason for anybody in this room to think for 1 second, with the largest population ever, with the best pricing ever in terms of wages, that people are not going to buy strawberries. You look around, you'll find this is true of everything that you sell people. Where are they eating? That's another question. You can see the dark line there is food retail sale, advanced retail sales at supermarkets. The other line with the dots is restaurant sales. People are eating away from home. A point that I made to a producer last week is you need to have a strategy to be in both segments. If your strategy is entirely focused on retail sales at supermarkets, you're going to be missing the growth opportunity that's in the restaurant segment. It's just going to keep on growing. I'm going to finish up here, be quick about it. But let's think about Thanksgiving. Anybody getting ready to celebrate Thanksgiving? Okay. Think about where your turkey is today. Do you know where your turkey is today? It's just about ready to be disassembled somewhere, right? You know? And so if you want to buy that turkey, it's been on a journey, right? And we know how this works. If we want to have people have food on their table for Thanksgiving, it's got to be in process today. Nobody's going to plant something today and have it ready by then. But the ROAs, what can you earn by being in different segments? We can look at this. We just got the new data. It's 14 years now. So let's look at what's happened. Let's talk a little bit about California. I'm going to use the USDA numbers. There's a lot of numbers. We'll have the slide deck available. Hopefully you can put it on the website. But when you look at this, we look down at net farm income, $12.5 billion for 2023. That's not a number that makes people happy. Why? Because in 2022, it was $21.7 billion of net farm income. Nobody in their right mind is going to be happy about that change, right? But I think it's an outlier. I think that's more of a fluke than anything else, because let's look at this a little bit differently. When I look at the revenue piece, when you take the numbers out and look at the revenue piece, the big drivers of revenue in California, none of them are really bad. So we're saying your top line is strong, but you're struggling with that cost dynamic right now. And you know that. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. In fact, when we look at those numbers, the top line there is total revenue, value of agricultural sector production in California. You guys are number one. You guys are absolutely number one with a bullet point. Nobody comes close to California in terms of value of production in agriculture. Be very proud of that. Who's number two? Anybody want to tell me that? Iowa. Good. Anybody who knows that is really a geek. Okay, so appreciate that. So Iowa's number two. But clearly we have a decent amount of revenue in the system, but we look at that net farm income at $12 billion, it's not a great number, right? But there's always shock absorbers going on. So when I look at this, once again, thermostat. This is one of the lowest ratios of net farm income to gross revenue that we've seen going all the way back to the early 2000s. What do I suspect is going to happen? It's going to bounce back. You guys are going to handle on the cost structure, you're going to make adjustments, and that revenue piece is going to stay strong. So I expect this dynamic. So sometimes it's too good to be true. Look at that in early 2010, 34%. That was too good to be true. Couldn't stay there. 19% is too bad to be true. It won't stay there either. Systems make adjustments. If you want to make an economist very unhappy, what's the best question to ask them? After they tell you what's going to happen, ask them, then what happens? Because there's always a further follow-up to that question. So I'm expecting to see California bounce back. Why? It's the nature of California's system to bounce back. You guys don't go down and stay down. Now, will it happen in 2025 like magic? No. It might be a multi-year period moving back to a more normalized profitability ratio on a go-forward basis. But you've done it before and you'll do it again. So, food manufacturing, retailing. We just got out the new numbers for 2023, 2024. What you're seeing is it was too good to be true. The ROAs in food manufacturing and food retailing were well above average. They're going back to average. Nobody likes to go from above average to average. It just doesn't feel very good. But it's not the end of the world. And underneath the surface, if we look at this, I want to point this out in three slides here. Here's that food manufacturing data. Top line is high performance, middle line is average performance, and the bottom line is low performance. Everybody had a great couple of years around that food inflation, that supply chain dislocation. We're going back to average. But what's the most important thing in here? Do you know where you are? Are you good at what you do? Because if you're close to the blue line, please come up and talk to the Wells Fargo bankers very, very intently about getting more money from us, okay? If you're on the green line, there's some other banks in the room, you might want to visit with them. But you got to know who you are, what you do, and how well are you doing it. Because it's not the market's problem. It's what am I doing with it? What else? Let's look at people that you sell to. I mean, a lot of people don't sell to food manufacturers. They sell to wholesalers. Once again, we saw that the COVID situation was great for fruit and vegetable wholesalers. We've gone back to a more normalized rate. The ROAs, the return on assets, are more normal. Doesn't sound like a lot of fun, but it's not terrible. Once again, who are you and how are you doing? That's the question. And then retailers. Retailers are starting to trend back down as well. So we heard a lot over the last political cycle about how retailers took advantage of this and that. You know what? There's always cycles, there's always events, but that long-term average is there for a reason. Know that number, know where you're at relative to it. So with that, I'm going to stop.